I'm Laura Murphy-Oates, and this is The Full Story. After a 5-year inquiry into abuse within institutions, including the church, the Child Abuse Royal Commission handed down its final report in late 2017. At the time, due to ongoing legal action and fears that the report would prejudice a jury, the findings about Cardinal George Pell were redacted. In April this year, Pell was acquitted of child sexual abuse charges and released from jail, clearing the way for the full report to be made public. On Thursday, it was.
Some explosive findings from the unredacted report into child abuse from the Royal Commission.
So I think it's more than 100 pages or so.
He should have known, and he would have known. That, in short, is what the Royal Commission had to say about George Pell's knowledge of clerical abuse.
They believe Cardinal George Pell did know that several priests were offending against children during the 70s and 80s, and in many instances did little to stop it.
Today, what George Pell knew. This report, or the redacted sections of this report, has been released. You've written like 4 or 5 articles on this in the past 24 hours. What has this been like?
It's been really difficult to match up the redacted and unredacted reports because there were chunks and bits and sections and single words redacted from the previous reports, and I've had to try and figure out what those words were.
Melissa Davey is a reporter and Melbourne bureau chief at Guardian Australia.
In other parts of the report, entire pages were redacted. So we're talking about more than 100 pages, so it's been quite laborious trying to go through and match up the two reports.
So you basically have one redacted report, one unredacted, and you're trying to merge them over the past day or so, right?
Exactly. There's a couple of sections of the Royal Commission's final report that had redactions in it, and I'm trying to figure out what we've learned that's new.
Okay, so you've gone through more than 100 redacted pages of this report. What are the biggest revelations in summary?
He has always said that while he was working in the church at the time, in various roles, he did not know the extent of abuse, that other people kept that abuse from him and deceived him. The Royal Commission found that was just implausible. They also had some really damning things to say regarding allegations of cover-up. So the Commission found that, and this is a direct quote, "We are satisfied that Cardinal Pell's evidence as to the reasons that the Catholic Education Office deceived him was implausible. We do not accept that Bishop Pell was deceived, intentionally or otherwise." And Pell also knew much more about notorious pedophile priest Gerald Ridsdale than he let on. Pell knew about sexual abuse in the church as early as 1973.
So these findings don't only reveal a lot about Ridsdale. You've written a comprehensive piece looking at what they say about 6 known or alleged offenders and Pell's knowledge of their abuse. We don't have time to go into all of them, but let's take a closer look at Ridsdale. Who is he?
Ridsdale is one of the most horrible, heinous pedophiles in Australia. Now, he committed offences against kids in the 1960s through to the 1980s, including while he was working as a chaplain at St Alpius Boys' School. He has abused hundreds of times. Nearly every year, new offences are revealed, and as recently as April, more offences were added.
So what did we already know before these redacted sections of this report came out about Ridsdale and Pell?
So we know that for a time, Pell and Ridsdale were close. They spent time living together in 1973 in a presbytery in Ballarat, but Pell has always maintained that he had no idea that Ridsdale was abusing children at this time. And we know that when Ridsdale abusing did come to light, when Pell definitely knew about it because Ridsdale had been charged, Pell supported him and attended his first court appearance with him in 1993. When Pell gave evidence before the Child Abuse Royal Commission about Ridsdale's offending in 2014, he said that once he did become aware of Ridsdale's offending, it was a sad story, but not of much interest to him.
That's what he said about Ridsdale's offending. It wasn't of much interest.
Yes, and there was a big backlash, as you can imagine, from advocates and survivors and just the public in general to those comments at the time.
Okay, that's his personal relationship with Ridsdale. What about his professional relationship? Was he involved in making decisions around Ridsdale?
In 2015, the Commission heard evidence that suggested Pell was involved in decisions to move Ridsdale around between parishes. And he was moved everywhere from Mildura to Swan Hill, Apollo Bay, Ballarat, Mortlake. And of course, that just meant that he continued to abuse from parish to parish.
When you say involved, how involved was he? What was his role?
In 1977, Pell was a member of the College of Consultors of the Ballarat Diocese. Now, this College of Consultors was a group of senior priests who advised the then Bishop Ronald Mulcairns about the appointment of priests, the movement of priests between parishes, and during the commission we heard time and time again of meetings that Pell was at where decisions were made to move Ridsdale. So in 1977, Pell was part of a meeting that sent Ridsdale to his next parish in Edenhope. In 1979, Pell was part of a meeting that discusses Ridsdale's resignation from Edenhope. And then in January 1980, when the diocese approved sending Ridsdale to the National Pastoral Institute in Elsternwick, Pell was there too. In 1982, he was also in a meeting that decided to move Ridsdale from Mortlake to another parish.
Pell's part of all these meetings where Ridsdale's moved time and time again. What has he said about his knowledge of Ridsdale in this time?
He said that in all of these meetings he didn't know that Ridsdale was offending against children and that the reason he was being moved around was because of that abuse in different parishes. He told the Commission that other senior figures in the church deceived him about Ridsdale's abusing and the reasons for moving him between parishes in all of those meetings. And the Commission found this is implausible. There is no way that as a senior figure in the church, Ridsdale's abusing was not known to him and would not have come up in those meetings.
Did we learn anything else significant about Pell and Ridsdale?
Yeah, so the Royal Commission found, and this is a direct quote, "We are satisfied that in 1973, Father Pell turned his mind to the prudence of Ridsdale taking boys on overnight camps. The most likely reason for this, as Cardinal Pell acknowledged, was the possibility that if priests were one-on-one with a child, then they could sexually abuse a child, or at least provoke gossip about such a prospect." So what the Commission is saying is that by this time, child abuse was well and truly on Pell's radar. And it was on his radar in relation to Ridsdale. Why would he be worried about Ridsdale taking boys on an overnight camp if that wasn't the case? So the Commission found that they were satisfied that by 1973, Pell was not only conscious of child sexual abuse by clergy, but that he'd considered measures to avoid situations which might provoke gossip about it. Not prevent the abuse from occurring, but that might prevent gossip about the church.
So, in summary, with these redacted findings, we now know that Pell knew about Ridsdale's abuse very early on, and that it's unlikely that he didn't know why he was being moved from church to church later on in the 80s, right?
That's right. What this report has done is show us what the Royal Commissioners thought of Pell's evidence, whether they believed him or not. And it shows us that in many cases, they just didn't.
Okay, so you wrote about several other priests and Pell's knowledge of their offending. Are there any that stand out?
One that really stood out to me, and it especially stood out to me when I was covering the Royal Commission a few years ago, was the priest Peter Searson. He was appalling. He was a parish priest at Doveton, which is a suburb southeast of Melbourne, and he was accused of sexually and physically abusing children in the 80s. Now, the school principal at the time received and passed on hundreds of complaints from parents and staff about Searson's inappropriate behaviour. He was inappropriate not just towards kids, but also towards other staff who resigned rather than have to deal with him. And we heard from numerous victims and teachers who had very similar stories of seeing the same things when it involved Searson. We heard from a victim who said that she was molested in the confessional box by Searson and that she ran away crying. And we also heard from a teacher who said he saw her running away from the confessional box, and he held the firm conviction that she was abused, that she must have been molested by Searson. So we had all of these reports and these corroborated reports that were told to the Royal Commission about just how prolific an abuser Searson was.
Was Searson held to account?
Searson died in 2009 without ever facing charges.
And was Pell told about any of this at the time? Where was he?
So at this point, Pell was Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne, of the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and he was appointed to that role in 1987. And there was a meeting in 1989 where Pell was told that Searson was displaying really strange and outrageous behaviours towards children. Like, he was told things like Searson was abusing animals in front of children, that he pointed a handgun at a child, that he was loitering in children's toilets and forcing children to kneel between his legs to say confession, and that teachers were refusing to send children to see Searson to try and make sure they were never alone with him. So Pell was given a list of grievances about Searson at this meeting, but one of the things that really struck me about Pell's evidence at the Royal Commission was he said that these complaints weren't really enough for him to act because they didn't involve anything of a sexual nature. There weren't any allegations in there that he was molesting or abusing children sexually.
That's a lot of people would be disturbed by these reports of treatment of children, right? How was that statement received?
I think there was a lot of shock, and it just kind of, again, points out the disconnect between the way that the general public perceives abuse compared to kind of the bar that had to be met for priests and senior figures in the church to take it seriously. And this idea that, it was a different time back then, things were thought of differently. We're talking in the 80s. It wasn't that long ago. And I would have thought that hearing that a priest had been torturing animals in front of children would be distressing and disturbing at any time.
Okay, and what have we found out about Pell and Searson from these redacted findings?
So we found out that on the basis of what was known to Pell in 1989, it should have been obvious to him that Searson was abusing children. That's what the Royal Commission found. And that he should have advised the Archbishop at the time to remove Searson, and he just didn't do so.
Okay, so between all this new evidence about Ridsdale and Searson and Pell, the full report seems to show that not only did he know about instances of abuse, but he failed to act to prevent this from happening again at multiple times with multiple priests. Is that right?
That's right. Previously, we knew a little bit about Searson and Pell and the incidents that were reported to him. Previously, the Commission did say that Pell should have done more, but this report, now that it's got the full findings in it, goes much further and is much more damning about what Pell didn't do.
Has Pell reacted to the release of these findings? What has he said in the past day or so?
Yeah, he issued a statement on Thursday afternoon. It was quite a brief statement, and he said he was surprised by some of the views of the Royal Commission about his actions. And he said that the views were not supported by evidence. Now, keep in mind that this was a 5-year inquiry where thousands of people were interviewed, where hundreds of thousands of documents were provided to the Royal Commission, where extremely experienced judges and researchers and barristers were involved, and yet Pell said that the findings were not supported by evidence.
Did he have anything to say about these specific allegations around Ridsdale and Searson?
He has maintained that he did not know of Ridsdale's abusing children at the time, and he says he did not know the reason that Ridsdale was being moved between parishes at the time, despite the senior roles he held in advising the bishop about the movement of priests. And he also said a meeting he had with a delegation from the Doveton parish in 1989, that's the meeting where they presented him with a list of grievances about Searson. He said that, well, none of those grievances mentioned sexual assaults, and nor did that delegation ask him to remove Searson, so he didn't. It's like he's saying that because there was no outright allegation of sexual abuse, and because the delegation didn't say, well, we want you to remove Searson explicitly, then he didn't need to act. And that is just another example of that disconnect between what anyone else would do and the way that Pell thought about these things.
Is this a surprising reaction from Pell?
Not at all. I mean, he has previously said that he's been made a scapegoat for the Catholic Church's failures. So Pell told Sky News in April as well that he's done a lot of good things, that when he was the Archbishop of Melbourne in 1996, he set up this scheme called the Melbourne Response. And that was the scheme established by the church to deal with allegations of sexual abuse within the church. So Pell said, well, look, if I didn't take it seriously, why would I set up this scheme? But there was another scheme in operation called Towards Healing within the church, and that was in place everywhere else in Australia. And there was a thought that Pell was setting up his own response separate to Towards Healing in Melbourne because he wanted his own scheme that was perhaps a little bit more tightly controlled. And many victims told the Child Abuse Royal Commission that the Melbourne response was really heartless in the way it dealt with them, that it was inadequate and that there were people who were perhaps not the best people to deal with allegations of abuse, that they weren't truly independent.
So Pell has held firm with his previous statements and rejected some of these findings outright. But this is a royal commission. These findings will hold some weight, right?
I think to many people the evidence is clear, and importantly, the Royal Commission gave thousands of people to share their experiences, to talk about their abuse, many of them for the first time. And so no matter what Pell says, there are institutions now who will forever be held to account. And there are changes happening in institutions as well that exist today, responsible for the care of children, to make sure that the chances of this happening again are greatly reduced. So there is, I think, from survivors and advocates, a feeling of frustration that senior figures can just turn around and ignore the very thorough recommendations and findings from the Royal Commission. But the report is there in black and white now. It's public. Anyone can see it. And there will be no excuse now for institutions today and in future not putting in place measures to keep children safe.
So as you've highlighted, we already knew a lot about George Pell and his role in a possible cover-up within the church. Now we know even more. What does this change? Will anything change going forward?
It's really hard to say. You know, I spoke to a solicitor who represented victims during the Child Abuse Royal Commission, Peter O'Brien, and he said that police have to investigate the Royal Commission's findings about Pell and what he knew about priests abusing children and his failure to act appropriately to stop them. He said to me, at the very least, there must be a criminal investigation. He said that the findings are extremely damning and suggest criminal, not only immoral, misconduct. But, you know, at the same time, no one has ever been convicted in Australia for the crime of concealment of child sexual abuse. So various states, including New South Wales and Victoria, have concealment-related offences, but they're very difficult to prosecute. You know, they're historical, they're often difficult to prove. And there was a priest who was convicted, Philip Wilson, but that conviction was ultimately overturned. So there has not been anyone convicted in Australia for that crime. So it's very difficult to prove and get through the courts.
Okay, but could this finally happen here with this case, with all that we know about Pell now?
Well, I did ask Victoria Police that question and they wouldn't say much, but they did say that they will receive a copy of the unredacted Child Abuse Royal Commission report and they would look at the findings relating to Cardinal George Pell, and they just said to me that they will then undertake an assessment of those findings. They said at this time it wouldn't be appropriate to comment further about any possible action, but at the very least they'll be reading those findings and considering what to do next.
Do you think we'll be hearing more on this in the coming months?
I think we'll never stop hearing about Cardinal George Pell. You know, there are also civil actions underway, and I think that this story, as always, is a far way from being over.
Okay, Mel, thanks so much.
No problem, thank you.
That's it for today. Thanks to Melissa Davey for her time. You can read more of her reporting on Pell, including a comprehensive breakdown of these findings at theguardian.com. This special episode was produced by myself and Miles Martignoni. He is also our executive producer, along with Gabrielle Jackson. If you liked this episode, don't forget to leave a rating or a review. Okay, catch you on Monday.